Camera footage obtained by Fox News Digital shows the car driving around 2:30 a.m. the night Nancy Guthrie was abducted. The sheriff's office says they're aware of the video, which was taken about 2.5 miles from her home and outside that 2-mile perimeter where investigators had asked for video. An FBI source tells NBC News since Nancy's disappearance, investigators have amassed 5,000 to 10,000 hours of footage that agents are now going through. It comes as the FBI is in the process of handing Nancy's home back over to Savannah and her family. Two law enforcement sources tell NBC News that after weeks of extensively searching the property, investigators no longer feel a need to seal the home off as a crime scene or restrict the family's access. Nancy Street also now closed down to public parking, limiting the media presence outside the home. This will now be the second time the property has been returned to the family. 2 days after Nancy's abduction, the Pima County Sheriff announces investigators had completed their search.
The scene is done. We're done with the residence. We have turned that over to the family.
But a day after the sheriff said that, the property was sealed off, this time by the FBI.
There are 2 surveillance systems within 80 meters of Nancy Guthrie's front door on the night she disappears. One of them sees nothing. One of them sees the suspect. And the one that sees the suspect, law enforcement has already declared dead. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is the central forensic puzzle of this entire investigation. It is also, in my assessment, the detail that tells us the most about who took Nancy Guthrie. Not the ski mask, not the backpack, not the holster. The cameras. Specifically, which camera worked, which one didn't, and why the distinction between the two is far more meaningful than anyone in the mainstream coverage has been willing to say out loud. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the methodology. In this analysis, we're going to move through this case the way evidence moves, slowly, with precision, without assumption. We are going to examine the surveillance infrastructure around Nancy Guthrie's home, the specific technical failure of the neighbor's Ring camera, the remarkable recovery of footage from a Google Nest device that was supposed to be offline, and then we are going to lay out 10 findings that I believe fundamentally change the shape of this investigation. Some of what you are about to hear has not been discussed elsewhere. Some of it directly contradicts public narratives that have gone unchallenged for weeks. Let's begin. Before we go into the case itself, I need to establish the analytical framework. Because this is not a recap. If you want a recap, there are dozens of channels producing them every day. This is a forensic breakdown. The difference matters. A recap tells you what happened. A forensic breakdown asks why it happened the way it did, and what that reveals about the person who made it happen. In this breakdown, I am treating every piece of public evidence as a data point. Every data point feeds into one of 4 analytical categories. Category 1. Physical evidence. Objects that can be observed, collected, and tested. In this case, a ski mask, a backpack, gloves, shrubbery used to obscure a camera, DNA found at the scene and away from the scene. Category 2. Digital evidence. Data generated by connected devices. In this case, doorbell camera footage, Ring camera logs, Google Nest backend data, a pacemaker application, and cell tower records. Category 3. Behavioral evidence. What the suspect's actions tell us about planning, capability, and knowledge. In this case, the route of approach, the timing, the deliberate camera obstruction, the specific items carried. Category 4. Institutional evidence. How law enforcement responded, what they said publicly, when they said it, and how it differed from what they actually knew. In this case, the gap between the sheriff's no footage statement and the FBI's subsequent release of that footage is, itself, evidence. We will move through all 4 categories, but the heaviest weight in this breakdown sits in Category 2, the digital evidence. Because the cameras are not just witnesses, they are mirrors. And what this suspect saw in those mirrors, or thought he saw, is the most revealing thing about him in this entire case. Understanding these analytical categories helps us separate what we know from what we assume. It helps us identify where the evidence is strong and where it is ambiguous. It prevents us from filling gaps in knowledge with narratives that feel right but aren't supported by facts. Throughout this analysis, when I say we know, I mean there is publicly confirmed evidence from law enforcement statements, verified reporting from multiple credible sources, or technical documentation that supports the claim. When I say it appears, or this suggests, I am making an analytical inference based on available evidence, not stating a confirmed fact. This distinction matters because in high-profile cases like this one, the space between what is known and what is assumed often gets collapsed in public discussion. My goal is to keep that space visible and to make clear when we are crossing from confirmed fact into analytical interpretation. Let us establish the factual timeline before we analyze it. Every time reference I use comes from statements made by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, or verified reporting from multiple major outlets. I am not speculating here. I am establishing the base layer of fact from which analysis can begin. Saturday, January 31st, 2026, 5:32 p.m. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of NBC Today Show anchor Savannah Guthrie, takes an Uber from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, to her daughter's house for dinner. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirms this. Investigators speak with the Uber driver. That ride is verified. Note that detail. She took an Uber. She did not drive. She had limited mobility. She was dependent on others for transportation. She was also, it would later emerge, a woman who kept daily medications in her home, carried a pacemaker, and had no active subscription on her doorbell camera. These are details that a person who monitored her routine would know. This is important from an analytical standpoint. Nancy Guthrie's patterns were observable. Her dependency on ride services meant her comings and goings were predictable to anyone who watched her home with regularity. The Uber pickup times, the return times, the frequency of trips, all of this would be visible to someone conducting surveillance from a nearby location, or through observation of her property over multiple days or weeks. Saturday, January 31st, 9:48 p.m. Nancy Guthrie is dropped off at home by family. The garage door opens at 9:48 p.m. It closes at 9:50 p.m. That 2-minute window is her entering her home. After that, there is no further external sighting of Nancy Guthrie, at least not of Nancy Guthrie alive and unharmed. This void is forensically significant. There are no Ring doorbell activations, no motion sensor lights triggering, no neighbors reporting sounds or disturbances, no phone calls made or received from her home phone or mobile device. The 4-hour window between her arrival home and the first digital anomaly, the camera disconnection at 1:47 a.m., represents a period of normalcy. Sunday, February 1st, 1:47 a.m. Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera disconnects. I want to repeat that precisely. Her Google Nest doorbell camera disconnects at 1:47 a.m. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos discloses this detail at a press conference on February 5th. He characterizes it as the result of the camera going offline due to no active subscription. Essentially, a technical loop, he says, where it would rewrite itself, kind of. It just kind of loops right and covers up. That explanation will matter later. Because it is incomplete, and in being incomplete, it obscures the single most important question in this case. The term disconnects is itself worth examining. In the context of a cloud-connected device like a Google Nest camera, disconnection can mean several things. It can mean the device lost its Wi-Fi connection. It can mean the device lost power. It can mean the device was physically unplugged. It can mean the device's account authentication session expired and it was unable to re-authenticate due to lack of subscription. Sheriff Nanos' explanation suggests the latter, that the camera's connection to Google's cloud services lapsed because there was no active paid subscription maintaining the account session. But this explanation, as we will see, does not fully account for what happened next, nor does it explain why footage was ultimately recoverable from Google's servers. Sunday, February 1st, 2:12 a.m., 45 minutes after the camera disconnects, its motion detection software registers a person approaching the front door. No video is captured, or so authorities initially believe. There is a person at the door. 25 minutes after the camera goes dark, and there is no footage, or so we are told. This is the moment that defines the case. At 2:12 a.m., someone, masked, gloved, carrying a backpack and wearing a visible holster, walks up to Nancy Guthrie's front door. The motion sensor embedded in the Nest camera's hardware detects this movement. The detection event is logged, but according to the initial assessment by local law enforcement, no video footage is associated with this detection event. The gap between detection and footage is where the entire investigation hinges. A camera detected a person, but the camera, we are told, did not record that person. How is this possible? That question will drive the next several sections of this analysis. Sunday, February 1st, 2:28 a.m. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker application disconnects from her phone. Her pacemaker, a medical device that monitors and regulates her heart rhythm, is wirelessly paired to a smartphone application. At 2:28 a.m., 16 minutes after the suspect is detected at the door, that connection drops. I want you to understand what that means forensically. A pacemaker application disconnects when the phone moves out of Bluetooth range, when the phone itself powers down, or when the physical connection between patient and device is interrupted in some other way. At 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker app goes silent. 16 minutes after a masked, armed figure stands at her front door. That is the window of abduction. Between 2:12 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie is taken from her home. 16 minutes. That is the operational window during which the suspect entered the home, made contact with Nancy Guthrie, overcame any resistance or confusion she may have offered, moved her from inside the residence to whatever vehicle or location he had staged outside, and departed the immediate area, all while her pacemaker remained in Bluetooth range of her phone. The moment the pacemaker app disconnects, one of two things happened. Either Nancy's phone was left behind, powered off, or destroyed, or Nancy herself was moved beyond Bluetooth range of the phone. Bluetooth range for medical devices like pacemaker monitors is typically 30 to 50 feet, depending on obstacles and interference. If Nancy was taken from her home and placed in a vehicle parked on the street or in a nearby driveway, the disconnection would happen the moment the vehicle moved beyond that 50-foot radius. This 16-minute window tells us something critical. The suspect moved quickly once inside. There was no prolonged confrontation, no extended conversation, no hesitation. He knew what he was there to do, and he executed it within a quarter of an hour. Sunday, February 1st, 11:56 a.m. Family members arrive at Nancy Guthrie's home and discover she is missing. Sunday, February 1st, 12:03 p.m. The family calls 911. Patrol cars arrive at 12:15 p.m. Nearly 10 hours pass between the abduction and the 911 call. Not because of neglect, because she lived alone, because no one expected her to check in overnight, because the infrastructure of her daily life, the community, the routine, the pattern of contact, did not flag her absence until the following afternoon. That gap, 10 hours, is operationally significant. It gave whoever took her the equivalent of a full working day's head start. 10 hours is enough time to drive across multiple state lines. It is enough time to reach Mexico, if that was the intended destination. It is enough time to secure a victim in a remote location, destroy evidence, change vehicles, alter appearance, and establish distance from the crime scene. The delay between abduction and discovery is one of the most valuable assets this suspect had. And it was an asset built into the situation by the simple fact that Nancy lived alone and was not expected to communicate with anyone until late Sunday morning at the earliest. Tuesday, February 10th, 9 days after the abduction. The FBI releases images and video footage of the suspect at Nancy Guthrie's front door. FBI Director Kash Patel announces, "Working with our partners, as of this morning, law enforcement has uncovered these previously inaccessible new images showing an armed individual appearing to have tampered with the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door the morning of her disappearance." 9 days after the abduction. 10 days after investigators were told there was no usable footage. The footage exists. It was always in Google's back-end servers. And that, as we will examine in detail, is the central forensic paradox of this case. The phrase, previously inaccessible, is doing a lot of work in that statement. It suggests the footage was not accessible to local investigators, not accessible through normal user account queries, not accessible through the standard legal request process that law enforcement typically uses to obtain Ring or Nest footage from individuals or from the companies themselves. But it was accessible to someone. It was accessible to the FBI's cyber division working directly with Google's engineering teams. It was accessible because it still existed on physical storage infrastructure somewhere in Google's distributed cloud network. And once the FBI knew to look for it in the right place, it was recoverable. This 9-day gap between no footage and here is the footage is not just a timeline detail. It is evidence of the complexity of cloud-connected surveillance systems and the gap between what local law enforcement can retrieve and what federal agencies with direct corporate partnerships can retrieve. It is also, potentially, evidence that the FBI used that footage internally for several days before releasing it to the public, an investigative strategy we will return to later in this analysis. To understand why one camera saw the suspect and another one didn't, you first have to understand the camera network that existed in that neighborhood on the night of February 1st. The Catalina Foothills area of Tucson is a relatively affluent residential neighborhood. It is the kind of community where smart home security systems are common. Ring doorbells, Nest cameras, ADT systems, outdoor motion-activated floodlights with integrated cameras. These are not unusual in this area. When investigators canvassed the neighborhood in the days following the abduction, they asked every resident to check their footage. Not just neighbors, but anyone within a plausible vehicle or walking distance. What they found was a fragmentary picture. Cars on the main road captured by cameras, pointing at streets. A property or two that caught general neighborhood movement, but nothing that captured the approach to Nancy Guthrie's front door. Now here is what matters. There are fundamentally two types of residential camera systems operating in this neighborhood, and they behave very differently. Ring cameras are manufactured by Amazon. They operate on a Wi-Fi network. Their core functionality, motion detection, live view, video recording, requires an active internet connection. Video is stored locally for a brief period and then uploaded to Amazon's cloud servers. If you have a subscription plan, you can access that footage through the Ring app for a defined retention window, typically 30 to 60 days. Critically, Ring cameras, because they operate over household Wi-Fi, are susceptible to Wi-Fi interference. If the Wi-Fi signal in a given area is disrupted by a jammer, by an outage, or by a targeted interference device, Ring cameras lose connectivity. When connectivity drops, recording to cloud ceases. Depending on the device and its local storage capacity, some Ring cameras continue recording locally, but this varies significantly by model. The neighbor whose Ring camera shows not available during the critical hours of February 1st, that is a Ring camera behavior on a disrupted Wi-Fi network. This system architecture is important to understand because it creates a vulnerability. A Ring camera is only as reliable as the Wi-Fi network it depends on. If that network is compromised, intentionally or accidentally, the camera's ability to capture and transmit footage is immediately degraded or eliminated. Most Ring users are not aware of this limitation. They see the camera on their porch, they see the app on their phone, and they assume that as long as both devices are powered on, the system is recording. But that assumption breaks down the moment the Wi-Fi signal is lost. And in the case of a deliberate Wi-Fi disruption using a signal jammer, that loss of connectivity can happen across multiple devices simultaneously, creating a coverage gap that affects every Wi-Fi dependent camera in the interference radius. Nest cameras operate differently. They also use Wi-Fi as their primary connection. But Google has built a cloud processing pipeline into the Nest ecosystem that operates somewhat independently of user-facing account status. When a Nest camera detects motion, it begins processing and transmitting that data in real time to Google's distributed cloud infrastructure, not just to the user's account. This is a subtle but critical distinction. The data does not only go to your account. It goes to Google's backend systems first, and then is allocated to your account's storage based on your subscription tier. If you have no subscription, the footage is not saved to your account's accessible storage. But that does not mean the data was never received by Google's servers. What it means is that the data arrived, was processed at some point in Google's pipeline, and remained in a back-end queue, awaiting either allocation to a user account or overwriting by newer data. The moment law enforcement reached out to Google with legal authority to access that queue, the data was still there. As forensic analyst Nick Barrero put it, a delete function is just telling the file system to ignore that data and feel free to use that space on the hard drive for new data. So until it's actually used again, that old data is still recoverable. Think of it like a voicemail that your provider received but never delivered to your mailbox because it was full. The call happened, the provider recorded it, your box simply never received it. But the provider still has it on their servers, and if someone with the right legal authority asks to retrieve it, it's there. That is, functionally, what happened with Nancy Guthrie's Nest camera footage. The implications of this architecture are profound. It means that a camera can appear offline or disconnected to the end user while still successfully transmitting data to the cloud provider's infrastructure. It means that the absence of footage in a user's account does not necessarily mean the absence of footage on the provider's servers. And it means that a suspect who believes he has neutralized a camera by disrupting its connectivity may be operating under a false sense of security, because the footage may have already been transmitted before the disruption occurred, or the camera may be transmitting through a backup pathway the suspect is unaware of. This is the technological gap that this suspect did not understand. And it is the gap that ultimately produced the only visual evidence investigators have of him. Now, let's talk about why the neighbor's Ring camera saw nothing. Because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely disturbing. There are three possible explanations for why the neighbor's Ring camera footage is listed as not available during the hours of Nancy Guthrie's abduction. Each explanation leads to a different conclusion about the suspect. Let me walk through all three. The simplest explanation is geometry. A Ring camera mounted on a neighbor's home is pointed in a specific direction. Unless it was specifically angled toward Nancy Guthrie's property, it would not capture her front door. Most residential doorbell cameras are pointed at the street immediately in front of the home, the driveway approach, the front path, the street, not at the adjacent property. There is evidence consistent with this explanation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department specifically asked neighbors to submit footage of cars, traffic, people, or pedestrians, suggesting the primary value of neighborhood footage was traffic reconstruction, not direct property surveillance. Under this explanation, the neighbor's camera simply wasn't pointed in the right direction. The suspect knew this, or got lucky. If it's the former, if he knew which cameras were pointed where, that implies reconnaissance. That implies advanced knowledge of the neighborhood's camera architecture. If it's the latter, pure luck, then we have a different kind of suspect. An opportunist who got fortunate with camera placement. I will tell you now, based on the totality of evidence in this case, I do not believe this was luck. The problem with the field of view explanation is that it assumes the neighbor's camera simply had no line of sight to Nancy's property. But neighborhoods like Catalina Foothills typically have properties with relatively open sight lines between adjacent homes. Driveways, front yards, street-facing facades. These are often visible from multiple angles across several properties. If the neighbor's camera was positioned on the front door, angled toward the street, and Nancy Guthrie's home was immediately adjacent or diagonal across the street, there is a reasonable probability that the camera's field of view would have included at least a portion of her property, her driveway, her front walkway, or the street directly in front of her home. The fact that investigators specifically asked this neighbor about footage, and the fact that the footage shows as not available rather than simply showing an empty frame with no relevant activity, suggests that something more than a simple field of view limitation is at play. The suspect may have approached Nancy Guthrie's home via a route that was specifically chosen to avoid the neighbor's camera angles. This requires two things: prior knowledge of the cameras and prior observation of their angles. In other words, reconnaissance visits to the neighborhood. This is not speculation. The FBI has confirmed that a photograph of the suspect exists without a backpack or holster, indicating he visited the property on a separate occasion, underdressed for violence. That was a reconnaissance visit. It is the only logical explanation for an image of the same person without the abduction kit. If he visited once without the kit, he visited to observe, potentially to time routines, potentially to map cameras. A person who maps cameras before an abduction does not walk through the neighbor's camera angle. He walks around it. He knows which side of the street to approach from. He knows which neighbor has a camera and which doesn't, which one is angled left and which one covers the street. That is not amateur behavior. This explanation is consistent with several other behavioral indicators in this case: the precise timing of the approach, the use of shrubbery to block Nancy's camera lens, the complete body coverage to avoid DNA transfer, the selection of a 2 a.m. approach window when the neighborhood would be dark and quiet. All of these choices suggest a person who thought carefully about how to move through space without being seen. A person who understood that cameras are the primary witness in modern residential crime, and that avoiding cameras requires not just covering one's face, but controlling one's route of approach, timing, and positioning relative to known surveillance devices. If the suspect did conduct reconnaissance visits to map camera locations and angles, then the neighbor's camera not capturing him is not a failure of the camera. It is a success of the suspect's planning. But there is a third explanation, and it is the one that should concern everyone who relies on Wi-Fi connected home security devices. This is the explanation that changes everything. On March 6, 2026, more than a month after the abduction, News Nation senior national correspondent Brian Enton reported that the FBI is actively investigating a possible internet outage in the neighborhood on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. A neighbor reported to investigators that his Ring camera history shows mysteriously not available during the critical hours. The FBI is now asking neighbors whether they experienced any internet disruptions that night. There is a name for a device that causes exactly this kind of disruption: a Wi-Fi signal jammer. A signal jammer broadcasts on the frequencies used by Wi-Fi networks, typically 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz, at a power level that overrides legitimate signals. Every device in range that relies on Wi-Fi connectivity, including Ring cameras, loses its internet connection. If a signal jammer was deployed in the vicinity of Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of February 1st, it would explain several things simultaneously. It would explain why the neighbor's Ring camera history is not available. The device lost Wi-Fi connectivity, and the footage window either didn't upload or didn't record. It would explain why Nancy's Nest camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m. It lost Wi-Fi connectivity, appearing offline to the user-facing account system. It would potentially explain the 25-minute gap between the camera's reported disconnection at 1:47 a.m. and the suspect's approach at 2:12 a.m. The jammer was activated 25 minutes before approach to ensure all cameras were offline before he walked up to the door. Now, Morgan Wright, a cybersecurity expert, offered a counter-argument. If they were using Wi-Fi jammers, then I would expect that we would not be able to see any video from the front door cameras. His point being that if jamming was consistent enough to knock out the neighbor's Ring camera entirely, it should have knocked out everything, including the Nest. The Nest camera may have already transmitted its most critical footage to Google's cloud before the jammer was activated. Read that again carefully. The Nest camera disconnects at 1:47 a.m. The suspect approaches at 2:12 a.m. There is a 25-minute window between those two events. If the jammer was activated at 1:47 a.m., the camera went offline at 1:47 a.m. But what had the camera already uploaded to Google's cloud in the minutes or hours before 1:47 a.m.? Google's privacy policy is unambiguous. That means you may not see a visual indicator when your camera is sending the video footage to our servers. Nest cameras transmit continuously. Every frame of motion detection, every moment of activity on the porch, it goes to Google's cloud as it happens, not in a scheduled batch. This means the footage that the FBI recovered from Google's backend servers was likely not footage captured after the camera disconnected. It was footage captured before the camera was knocked offline. It was footage the camera had already uploaded. Footage that was sitting in Google's processing queue, waiting to be overwritten from the moments before 1:47 a.m. or from earlier reconnaissance visits by the suspect. And the suspect had no way of knowing that, because the camera appeared dead. The camera appeared to have no subscription. The camera appeared to have nothing to offer investigators. He thought he was walking up to a dead camera. He was not. This is finding number 1 of 10, and we have not even gotten to the most disturbing observations yet.
Who had surveilled Nancy's home and mapped the neighborhood would know that approaching from the direction of that vacant lot, moving toward the rear of the property, reduces exposure to any cameras and reduces the likelihood of being seen. It is the path that a surveillance-conscious individual would identify and use. Dabb has said on the record that the home was likely canvassed before the crime. If someone walked this neighborhood ahead of time and mapped it, and Dabb, as a career homicide detective, believes they would have known every one of these features.
On February 5th, Sheriff Chris Nanos tells the public that Nancy Guthrie did not have an active Nest subscription. He explains that the camera was disconnected at 1:47 a.m. He says the software detected a person at 2:12 a.m., but no video is available. He uses the phrase that the camera would rewrite itself, kind of. It just kind of loops right and covers up. This is the sheriff speaking from information provided by his analysis teams as of February 5th. He is not lying. He is reporting what the initial technical assessment found. But here is what the sheriff's analysis teams may not have fully explored yet. What happens in Google's back-end infrastructure between the moment a Nest camera captures footage and the moment that footage either becomes accessible to a user or gets overwritten by newer data? Sheriff Nanos' explanation reflects a user-level understanding of how Nest cameras work. If you don't have a subscription, you don't have access to stored footage. Camera may continue to function for live viewing, but recorded video is not retained in your account. From the perspective of a local investigator checking the user's Nest account, there would be nothing to see. The account would show no video history for the time period in question. That user-level assessment is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not account for the server-side data pipeline that Google operates independently of individual user accounts. The FBI, unlike a local sheriff's department, has both the technical resources and the legal framework to go directly to Google's engineering and server infrastructure teams. They do not just request user account data, which would show no subscription, no footage. They request everything: back-end logs, processing queues, server-side records, temporary data stores. Former FBI cyber agent Adam Malone explains the process. They would have all looked at their development pipelines to say, hey, do we process any data? Do we have any historical data that's still sitting here, waiting to be purged? Google's Nest cameras, Malone explains, transmit video data to Google's cloud in real time. This data enters a processing pipeline. For users with active subscriptions, it is allocated to accessible cloud storage where it can be reviewed through the app. For users without active subscriptions, it is not allocated to accessible storage. But it does not immediately disappear from Google's servers. It sits in a queue, tagged for eventual deletion or overwriting, but it remains on the physical storage infrastructure until that overwriting actually occurs. The FBI found footage in that queue. The footage had not yet been overwritten. It existed in what is technically called residual data, data that exists on a storage system but has been marked as available for reuse, without yet being reused. Like a document you send to the recycling bin but haven't permanently deleted. Google's bin had not been emptied. FBI Director Kash Patel's statement confirms this. The video was recovered from residual data located in backend systems. This recovery process represents a level of technical sophistication and legal coordination that most local law enforcement agencies do not have routine access to. It requires not just a legal subpoena or warrant, which the Sheriff's Department could also obtain, but direct technical collaboration with the cloud provider's engineering teams to access server infrastructure that is not part of the user-facing product. The FBI has established relationships with major technology companies precisely for situations like this. When a major investigation requires access to back-end data, the FBI can deploy specialized cyber agents who understand cloud architecture and can work directly with company engineers to identify, extract, and preserve data that would not be accessible through normal legal request channels. This is what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case. The Nest camera was physically removed from Nancy Guthrie's home. It was not simply turned off or unplugged. It was taken. Investigators note the camera is missing after the abduction. The suspect took the camera with him. Why? Because he knew the camera was there. He knew it was pointed at the door, and he wanted to ensure there was no physical evidence on the device itself. He took the hardware. But the data was not on the hardware. The data was in Google's cloud, in a processing queue in a server farm somewhere in the United States, beyond physical reach, beyond destruction by a man in a ski mask carrying an Ozark Trail backpack through Tucson at 2 a.m. He took the camera. He did not take the evidence, because he didn't know the evidence was somewhere he couldn't reach. This is one of the most forensically significant miscalculations in this entire case, and it tells us something precise and important about the suspect's understanding of technology, which is finding number 2. The act of removing the camera tells us that the suspect understood the camera was a threat. He knew it could contain footage of him. He knew that leaving it in place would give investigators potential evidence, so he took it. But the act of removing only the camera and not doing anything to address the cloud storage component tells us that the suspect's technical knowledge was limited to the physical layer of the surveillance system. He understood cameras as physical devices that record to physical storage. He did not understand cameras as cloud-connected endpoints that transmit data continuously to remote servers. This is a gap in knowledge that is common among people who have grown up in the era before cloud computing became ubiquitous, or among people who have used cloud-connected devices without ever thinking deeply about how they actually work. It is the knowledge profile of someone who knows what a Nest camera is and what it does at a surface level, but who has never worked in IT, never studied network architecture, and never thought through the implications of real-time data transmission. That gap is exploitable, and in this case, it was exploited, not by investigators intentionally, but by the structural reality of how Google's infrastructure operates. We have now laid out the factual and technical foundation of the surveillance failure in this case. Now I want to move into the analytical observations, the 10 findings that, in my assessment, define what we actually know about who took Nancy Guthrie. This is not an FBI profile. This is not a psychological diagnosis. This is an evidence-based analytical assessment. The camera disconnects at 1:47 a.m. The suspect approaches at 2:12 a.m. 25 minutes separates those two events. Every major media outlet has reported these two timestamps. Almost none have asked the question that an analyst asks. Why 25 minutes? If the suspect knew the camera was connected and wanted to ensure it was offline before approaching, he would wait long enough to be confident it was down. 25 minutes is a specific interval. Not 5 minutes, not 2 hours. 25 minutes. This suggests operational planning. He gave himself a window he believed was sufficient. He was executing a plan with built-in timing buffers. Alternatively, if the Wi-Fi jammer theory is correct and the jammer activated at 1:47 a.m., then the suspect positioned himself within jammer range at 1:47 a.m. and waited 25 minutes before moving to the door. This would place him within the neighborhood, within effective jamming range, for at least 25 minutes before the approach. During those 25 minutes, he was stationary somewhere in or near that neighborhood, watching, waiting, counting down. That detail, 25 minutes of waiting in the dark should tell investigators something about where he staged from. Was there a vehicle parked on a side street? Was there a location with a clear line of sight to Nancy's front door where he could observe without being observed? Was there a property with visual cover, a row of trees, a parked RV, a construction site, where he could position himself and a jamming device without drawing attention? The 25-minute interval is not random. It is deliberate. It represents a calculated buffer between the moment the camera went offline and the moment the suspect felt confident enough to approach. That calculation tells us something about his risk tolerance, his operational discipline, and his understanding of how long it takes for a dead camera to be truly dead in his assessment. A person who waits 25 minutes is not acting on impulse. A person who waits 25 minutes is following a plan. And that plan was built on assumptions about camera behavior that turned out to be partially incorrect. This is the central contradiction of this suspect's technical profile. He was sophisticated enough to know cameras existed. He surveilled the property on at least one prior occasion without the abduction kit. He knew about the Nest camera. He physically removed it. He knew about cameras generally. He covered his face, wore gloves, covered his entire body to prevent DNA and visual identification. But he did not know that a camera without a subscription still sends data to Google's cloud. He did not know that cloud data has a survival window that extends beyond user account accessibility. He did not know that the FBI could recover footage from a camera he had physically taken from the property. His technical knowledge had a ceiling, and that ceiling sat precisely at the point where consumer-facing product knowledge ends and infrastructure-level cloud architecture begins. He understood how cameras appear to users. He did not understand how cameras behave at the server level. That gap is not a small gap. It is a generational or educational gap. It suggests someone who has used smart home devices, perhaps someone who has seen Ring cameras, knows about subscriptions, understands the user-facing logic of these systems, but not someone with IT infrastructure knowledge or any exposure to how cloud platforms actually process and retain data. This profile is consistent with someone in their 40s, 50s, or 60s who adopted smart home technology as a consumer but never worked in the technology sector. Someone who understands that no subscription means no footage, because that's what the marketing materials say, but who does not understand that the underlying data transmission happens regardless of subscription status. It is also consistent with someone who may have researched how to defeat home security cameras using publicly available information, YouTube videos, online forums, Reddit threads, but who did not have access to or understanding of technical documentation about how cloud service providers actually handle data, retention, and processing. The fact that the FBI is now asking neighbors whether they experienced internet outages on the night of February 1st tells us that law enforcement itself does not believe the field of view explanation is sufficient. If the neighbor's camera simply wasn't pointed at Nancy's door, there would be no reason to investigate an internet outage. The camera footage would simply show nothing relevant, and the absence would be unremarkable. The fact that investigators are probing the outage means they believe the neighbor's camera may have been specifically and deliberately neutralized. And if it was deliberately neutralized, if a Wi-Fi jammer was used, then the suspect carried a device that is not available at the average hardware store. Wi-Fi jammers are illegal for civilian use in the United States. The FCC prohibits the sale, possession, and use of signal jammers by individuals. To obtain one, you either purchase illegally from a gray market source or acquire one through channels that suggest access to certain professional or criminal networks. A person who brings a legally prohibited electronic warfare device to an abduction of an 84-year-old woman is not acting on impulse. This is not domestic violence misapplied. This is not a robbery that escalated. This is a planned extraction with electronic countermeasures. Wi-Fi jammers are commercially available through international online marketplaces, particularly from sellers based in China and Eastern Europe. They are marketed as privacy devices or anti-surveillance tools, and can be purchased for anywhere from $50 to $500, depending on range and power output. Shipping these devices into the United States is illegal, but enforcement is inconsistent, and packages containing small electronic devices often clear customs without detailed inspection. The fact that the suspect may have obtained and deployed such a device tells us several things. First, he was willing to engage in illegal procurement to accomplish his goal. Second, he understood enough about wireless network security to know that Wi-Fi jamming was a viable countermeasure against residential cameras. Third, he had access to resources, financial and informational, that allowed him to acquire a specialized device that most people would not know how to obtain. Why take that risk? Because he believed the camera was the only source of footage from that location. If he destroys the camera, he destroys the evidence. But this logic only holds if you don't know about backend cloud retention. The moment the FBI established that Google had backend data, the camera removal became irrelevant. It cost him extra time and exposure. It gained him nothing. This is not the behavior of someone with a deep understanding of forensic digital evidence. This is the behavior of someone who understands the hardware layer of surveillance. Cameras record. Remove the camera, remove the recording. That logic is approximately 20 years out of date. The time spent removing the camera, likely between 30 seconds and 2 minutes depending on the mounting hardware and the suspect's familiarity with the device, was time during which he was visible to any other cameras in the area, vulnerable to a neighbor looking out a window, and exposed to the possibility of someone driving past and noticing a masked figure on a residential porch at 2 a.m. A person with professional training in evidence destruction would know that the camera's physical presence is irrelevant if the footage has already been transmitted to a remote server. A person with that knowledge would not waste time removing the device. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe was direct in his assessment. No person with law enforcement or military training would ever carry a firearm in a holster like that. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Steve Moore went further. He's got a small semi-automatic pistol meant for concealment that he could have put in his pocket, but instead he's holstering it in a holster made for a large frame revolver. They don't even match. The gun and holster don't match. The suspect has no firearms training. He has no military or law enforcement background. And yet this same person conducted at least one reconnaissance visit before the abduction, knew enough to cover his entire body to prevent DNA transfer, appears to have deployed electronic countermeasures against the camera network, approached at a precisely timed interval after the camera disconnection, and successfully carried out a planned abduction from a gated neighborhood home without leaving a chest. He brought a gun because he believed it was necessary to control an 84-year-old woman. But he did not train with that gun. He did not practice drawing it. He did not ensure that his carry method was tactically sound. This is the behavior of someone who thought about the gun as a prop, a tool to create fear and compliance, rather than as a weapon he might actually need to use. That mindset is consistent with someone who planned a low-resistance abduction of an elderly, mobility-limited victim, and who did not anticipate armed resistance or the need for tactical firearms proficiency. The DNA recovered from the glove, found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, returned no matches from the CODIS database, a database that, as of February 2026, contains profiles from approximately 22 million individuals. Once a match is found, even a distant match, genealogists begin constructing family trees, working backward from the known relative to identify common ancestors, and then working forward through multiple generations to identify all living descendants of those ancestors who fit the age, gender, and geographic profile of the suspect. This process can take weeks or months. In the Golden State Killer case, it took investigators several months to move from an initial genetic match to a confirmed suspect. In other cases, the process has been faster, but it depends heavily on the quality of the match, the completeness of the family tree data, and the number of potential candidates that must be ruled out through additional investigation. The fact that investigators have turned to genetic genealogy tells us they have exhausted more conventional identification methods. They have run the DNA through CODIS with no hit. They have likely run the physical description and gait analysis against known offenders with similar profiles. They have reviewed thousands of tips, and none of it has produced an arrest. Genetic genealogy is now the best remaining tool, but it is not a fast tool. Here is the detail that should generate far more conversation than it has. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker is being used as a location tracking device by investigators. Parsons Corporation, a defense and technology firm, is operating a device called Blue Fly in the Tucson area, deployed both aerially via aircraft and on the ground, specifically designed to detect signals from pacemakers and other medical electronics. A pacemaker emits a wireless signal for device monitoring and data transfer purposes. This signal, under normal circumstances, is read by a compatible app on a nearby phone. But the signal itself is detectable by specialized equipment within a certain range. If Nancy Guthrie is alive somewhere in or near Tucson, and her pacemaker is still functioning, and investigators can fly close enough, that signal can potentially betray her location. This is extraordinary. No missing person investigation at this scale has ever used pacemaker signal detection as a primary search methodology in quite this way. It represents the collision of medical device technology, location intelligence, and missing persons investigation in a form that simply did not exist a decade ago. The fact that the pacemaker app disconnected from her phone at 2:28 a.m. tells us her phone was either taken, destroyed, or moved beyond Bluetooth range at that moment. But it does not tell us whether her pacemaker is still transmitting. If she is alive, it is likely transmitting. If it is transmitting, it is detectable. And that is the most powerful piece of investigative technology in this case right now. Pacemakers are designed to communicate wirelessly with external monitoring devices to allow doctors to check device function, battery life, and heart rhythm data without requiring the patient to come into a clinic. This communication typically occurs over short-range radio frequencies, and the signal strength is relatively weak, designed for communication within a few feet to a few dozen feet, not for long-range transmission. However, with the right detection equipment, these signals can be identified at greater distances. The Blue Fly system reportedly uses highly sensitive radio frequency detection technology combined with directional antennas and signal triangulation to locate medical devices over areas spanning several square miles. If Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker is still active and transmitting, and if she is being held somewhere within the search radius that investigators are covering, the pacemaker's signal could provide the most precise location data available. Unlike cell phone tracking, which can be defeated by turning off the phone or removing the battery, a pacemaker cannot be turned off without surgical intervention. As long as the device is functioning, it is transmitting. This makes the pacemaker both a medical lifeline and an investigative asset. And it is an asset that the suspect may not have anticipated. Let me return to the FBI's statement that the suspect appears in at least one photograph without a backpack or holster, suggesting a visit to the property on a different occasion. The sheriff has noted that the doorbell camera footage does not include dates or timestamps, so the sequencing of visits is not confirmed. But the FBI's focus on the weeks before the abduction, their statement that this might help explain why investigators appear to be so focused on the weeks before her abduction, suggests they believe there were reconnaissance visits. The shrubbery he placed over the camera lens is also notable. He didn't bring the shrubbery with him. He picked it up from the surrounding area. That means he had observed or anticipated that the camera was there, and that he would need something physical to block it. He didn't bring a lens cover. He improvised with local vegetation. But the improvisation happened in a planned context. He knew the camera was there before he arrived. The combination of a prior visit and the specific porch-level camera obstruction behavior suggests this was at minimum his second or third time at that address. Each prior visit represented an additional risk of being seen by the camera, by Nancy herself, by neighbors. He accepted that risk as part of his preparation. The use of shrubbery to obscure the camera lens is itself an interesting detail. It suggests the suspect wanted to block the camera's view without completely disabling it or making it obvious that tampering had occurred. If he had spray painted the lens, smashed it, or covered it with tape, the tampering would have been immediately obvious to anyone reviewing the camera's live feed, or to Nancy herself if she happened to check the app. By using natural vegetation that could plausibly have blown into position by wind or been placed there by an animal, the suspect created ambiguity. The camera was obstructed, but the obstruction looked incidental rather than deliberate. This is a subtle form of operational security, maintaining plausible deniability even in the act of tampering. The fact that he thought to do this, and that he used materials from the immediate environment rather than bringing something with him that could later be traced through forensic analysis, tells us he was thinking about evidence and attribution even in the smallest details of his approach. The sheriff said there was no footage. The FBI released footage 9 days later. This is an institutional gap that has not received sufficient forensic attention. There are two interpretations. First, the sheriff was working from the information his teams had. Local law enforcement did not have the technical access or the Google partnership needed to extract back-end data. When the FBI took over that dimension of the investigation, they went deeper and found what the local teams couldn't. Second, and this is the more controversial reading, the FBI had already identified or narrowed in on a suspect using that footage internally before releasing it publicly. Former Detective Joseph Giacalone suggested precisely this. You're trying to keep these things close to the vest. I think they worked this angle for a couple days. If Giacalone is right, the FBI possessed the footage well before February 10th. They used it first to try to quietly identify the suspect through electronic investigative tools, phone records, traffic camera data, cell tower pings. The man detained on February 10th via a series of electronic investigative tools, including phone usage information and traffic data. He was identified using that footage. He was detained, he was questioned, and he was released. The footage was not released to the public until the internal identification attempt failed to produce an arrest. At that point, engaging the public became the next move. This sequence, internal use followed by public release, is standard investigative practice. But it also tells us that the FBI's confidence in identifying the suspect through conventional electronic forensics was not sufficient. The footage exists. The image is relatively clear, given its grainy doorbell footage. And the FBI's internal effort to match it to an identity produced a detainee who walked free. This suspect, as of the most recent reporting, has not been publicly identified. The 9-day gap between the sheriff's statement and the FBI's release raises important questions about investigative strategy and interagency coordination. If the FBI had the footage earlier, why did the sheriff tell the public there was no footage? There are several possible answers. One possibility is that the sheriff genuinely did not know. The FBI may have been working a parallel track, coordinating directly with Google, and may not have shared that information with local investigators until the analysis was complete. This would be consistent with federal practice in cases where the FBI takes operational lead. They often restrict information flow to prevent leaks and maintain investigative advantage. Another possibility is that the sheriff knew the FBI was pursuing back-end data recovery, but was instructed not to disclose that effort publicly in order to avoid alerting the suspect that usable footage might exist. By publicly stating that no footage was available, the sheriff may have been creating a false sense of security for the suspect, encouraging him to believe he had successfully avoided surveillance and reducing the likelihood that he would flee or destroy additional evidence. A third possibility is that the FBI deliberately delayed public release in order to first attempt identification through classified or sensitive investigative methods that they did not want to expose in a public trial. This could include cell site simulators, advanced facial recognition against restricted databases, or surveillance of individuals identified through phone or internet activity patterns. Whichever explanation is correct, the gap itself is evidence of the complexity and multi-layered nature of modern digital investigations. The days when a local sheriff could control and direct all aspects of a major criminal case are long gone. Federal agencies bring resources and capabilities that local departments simply do not have, and that disparity creates coordination challenges and information asymmetries that can be exploited for investigative purposes, but that can also create public confusion and mistrust. I have saved this for last. Consider the totality of what this suspect did electronically. He disconnected a camera, or appeared to, possibly using a jammer. He created a neighborhood-wide internet disruption. He physically removed the camera hardware from the scene. He covered his body entirely to prevent DNA transfer. He wore gloves from approach to departure. He has no DNA match in a database of 22 million profiles. Every one of those actions was aimed at a single goal: eliminating evidence. And yet, despite all of it, despite the mask, the gloves, the jammer, the camera removal, the meticulous DNA avoidance, the FBI still got his footage. From a back-end server he had no knowledge of, uploaded by a camera he thought was dead, retained in a processing queue he didn't know existed. The forensic containment effort this suspect executed was extensive, and it failed. But here is the disturbing part. It nearly worked. Without Google's back-end data recovery, without the FBI's direct engagement with Google's engineering infrastructure, without the residual data sitting in that processing queue, this case has no footage. None. The neighbor's camera shows nothing. Nancy's camera is gone. One camera saw nothing. One camera saw everything. The difference between them is not angle. It is not subscription status. He thought he had covered every lens. The investigation continues.